Well, good evening and welcome everyone. Wow, what a crowd. This is Capacity Plus on a midweek school night as such, isn't it? Well done everyone for making the effort to come tonight. Must say we are running a little bit late to start with, about 10 minutes, but that doesn't mean the session will be cut short. We'll be running to about 7:10. So here we are at the Climate Commission's community conversation here at the Town Hall. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kim Miller and I'm your facilitator this evening. I'm a former newsreader and journalist with Southern Cross Television. I'm now a freelance writer and communications specialist. And indeed, it's my role this evening to ensure that as many questions as possible get answered tonight. Well, fresh from launching the Critical Decade report yesterday, we are indeed very privileged to have 5 of our climate commissioners present tonight. The commissioners present are Professor Tim Flannery, Professor Will Steffen, Professor Leslie Hughes, Mr. Roger Beale and Dr. Susanna Elliott. Before we start this evening, I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the elders from other communities who may be with us this evening. Now, the aim of this evening is to begin a conversation. The Commission is here to listen, as well as to share some of their knowledge and experiences. So we'll hear from them on what they've heard and seen since arriving in Tasmania, and looking at their schedule have been incredibly busy for the last couple of days. But there'll also be an opportunity later on tonight for you to ask questions of the Commission. Now first, I'd like to introduce in more detail a man very familiar to many of you, and that's Professor Tim Flannery, who's Chief Climate Commissioner. Professor Flannery is one of Australia's leading writers on climate change and an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist. He was named Australian of the Year in 2007 and is currently Panasonic Chair in Environmental Sustainability at Macquarie University. Professor Flannery has held various academic positions, including Professor at the University of Adelaide, Director of the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, Principal Research Scientist at the Australian Museum, and Visiting Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. Please make welcome this evening Professor Tim Flannery.
Well, thank you for that fantastic welcome to Hobart. This is a great crowd. It's fantastic. It's a totally full room. I think it's the most beautiful venue that we've met in yet, which is all very good, and we're very, very pleased to be here tonight. For the Climate Commission, this is our 15th conversation that we've had around the country with people since we were established in February last year. We've got an interesting job to do, really. We were established as a result of a promise by the federal government, the last election, and we're tasked with really going around Australia, engaging in a dialogue with Australians about all aspects of climate change, whether it be the science, the economics, or what's happening internationally, politically. And it's an important job, we feel, because in a democracy, you're just not going to get the sort of decisions made, political decisions made over the longer term that are required to deal with complex issues like climate change unless you have a relatively well-informed public. So we're very happy to be engaging with dialogue, engaging with discussions about whatever, but it means also you can ask absolutely anything you want, any question you want of us. We'd be delighted to do our best to answer. Unfortunately, we've got quite a lot of expertise on the Commission. You see here 4 of our commissioners. Mr. Jerry Houston is our 5th commissioner. He can't be with us at the moment, but he is from the oil and gas industry. He was president of BP Australasia for a number of years before retiring, and really brings a good business sense to our discussions on how businesses particularly deal with the issue of climate change. Among those we have with us though this evening is Professor Will Steffen from ANU. Will is one of the most respected climate scientists in the world. If you've got any questions about climate modelling, about any of the nitty-gritty of climate science or the Earth system, he's your go-to man. He's fantastic. And we have, oh goodness, Leslie Hughes, Professor Leslie Hughes. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit tired. It's been a very long day. Professor Leslie Hughes from Macquarie University, who's an expert in adaptation and particularly in biodiversity impacts of climate change. So in a place like Tasmania where you have this spectacular biodiversity, she's the person to ask about any aspect of climate impacts on that. We have Roger Beale, who has for many years now served the Australian government in the international arena, negotiating on our behalf in the climate arena, has also advised government and been involved in almost every aspect of climate change, I suspect. Dare I say it, Roger, from forestry onwards. I don't know whether you wanted me to say that tonight, but so he's a great source of information about anything in the economic area. And we have Susanna Elliott, who is Director of the Australian Science Media Centre, our final commissioner this evening, whose expertise really is in the area of the communication of science and the media. So if you have any questions about how science is portrayed in the media or anything else, Susanna's your person. The Commission works in a number of ways. We have meetings like this, we issue reports, and we have a report which you have on your seat this evening on potential climate impacts in Tasmania. We also have a website, and that has our previously published reports on it, and is a good source of information for those who want additional information on anything that we say tonight. So going to the website's a great idea. I want to just make clear one thing about the Commission is that we are as apolitical as we can be. We want to be seen, and we need to be seen by the public as an independent and authoritative source of information on all aspects of climate change, which isn't charged with any sort of political bias. And I think you can see that in our works, in that our first major report launched in May last year in the Australian Federal Parliament, called The Critical Decade, and it laid out the basis of the science of climate change, was endorsed by both sides of Australian politics, by the Liberal Party and the Labor Party and the Greens. So that's what we'd like to achieve. We want to be independent, we want to be trusted and authoritative in that sense. So don't ask us any questions about policy. We won't give you an opinion on policy. If you want that, you might ask a taxi driver or anyone else, but we're probably the worst people to ask. So having said that, I'll step down and we shall begin our session. It's your evening. Please feel free to ask whatever you want. Oh, before we do that though, we have a presentation which Will give us on just outlining the basics of climate science. Thank you.
Right, we tend to get a lot of questions about climate science, so it's useful and it actually saves time in the long run to go through just a few points. So if we could just have the presentation up, I think, let's see if it goes. There it does go. Yeah. Okay, let's start out with what everyone considers the iconic single graph showing climate change. This is a graph of air temperature over the entire planet, and it's a long time scale. It goes from 1880 on the left all the way over to 2010. If you look at that, you certainly see that not every year is warmer than the one before it. There's a lot of ups and downs. There's a lot of variability from year to year and even across a decade. It's not unusual to have the temperature plateau for a decade. But climate scientists look at multiple decades. We take a minimum of 3 or 4. We like even more. We've got a 100 years record here. Now you can see quite clearly on the right-hand side of that record, which corresponds to the time period when most of the greenhouse gases have been emitted, that temperature trend is going strongly upwards. In other words, the air at the planet's surface is warming, and it's warming quite strongly. But if you're a scientist, you actually spend less time looking at that graph and more time looking at this one. This is a graph of the heat content of the ocean. Now, why do scientists put so much emphasis on this? Because you'll never see this in the newspapers or on the blogs. The reason is 90% of the extra heat that's being trapped by greenhouse gases in the lower atmosphere actually finds its way into the ocean, doesn't stay in the air. So this is the smoking gun, if you like. Now, this graph goes from 1950 to nearly 2010. And you'll actually notice that there are 3 lines. And there are only 3 groups around the world that actually have the expertise to painstakingly analyze all the data coming up from thousands of instruments in the ocean. The red line, the more prominent one, you should be very proud of in this city because it actually comes from Hobart. This comes from the marine labs just down the road from where we are now. And it's one of the 3 most authoritative groups in the world on understanding how our ocean is changing. And again, you see the warming trend is absolutely clear. There's a strong upward trend to that line. In fact, if you actually look at the slope, the angle, it is increasing a bit toward the end, meaning that the rate of warming is increasing over the last couple decades. So we've seen the air, we've seen the ocean, now let's look at the ice. There is a jagged red line. That actually represents the rate of loss of that ice that floats over the North Pole. So we're going to switch to the other end of the planet, and that part of the Earth is actually warming much more than the average. And we can see it in a sharp drop of the amount of sea ice over the Arctic Ocean. So the point is, we don't rely on one record or one bit of data. There are literally tens and hundreds of independent data sets that are consistent. The Earth is warming. So the question is, all right, the Earth is always warmed and cooled. Is there anything different about what we're seeing over the last 50 years or over the last century? And the answer is yes. Again, this has been thoroughly researched by the scientific community. In fact, the basic physics has been known since the early 1800s. And it has to do with these things called greenhouse gases, or the greenhouse effect. This cartoon shows very simply how it works. The Earth's surface is heated by energy from the sun. And that energy is mainly of two types. Visible light is part of the energy coming in from the sun. And it's a certain wavelength, that's why you can see it. But it also comes in at a shorter wavelength, which is more energetic, and it burns your skin if you go out to the beach or the waterfront on summer. This is how most of that energy comes in. Now, if the Earth didn't have a way to get rid of it, it would simply heat up and heat up and heat up and then burn up. Well, the Earth has been around for over 4 billion years, so it knows how to get rid of energy too. And it does that through heat, not light, not ultraviolet radiation. The energy goes back out via heat. Now, this is important because those gases that sit in the lower atmosphere are transparent to the energy of the sun coming in, but they are not transparent to the heat going out. They absorb a fraction of it, and when they re-release that fraction, some of it comes back down toward the surface and gives us extra warmth. It's an important natural effect. If we took out all greenhouse gases, stripped them away, and just had oxygen and nitrogen, we could breathe quite well, but we couldn't survive because the Earth would be 33 degrees colder all the time. It means it would be frozen. So it's very important that we have them. That physics is very well understood. So it's a no-brainer for scientists that if we add additional greenhouse gases, and carbon dioxide is the most important of these, the planet's going to warm a little bit more, and if we add even more, it's going to warm even more. So that's physics is very well understood. There are many ways we actually check that understanding. I'm only going to show you one. So let's again look at a temperature graph, hasn't appeared yet, from 1900 to the year 2000. This is the last century. So we can take a climate model and say, let's drive it by only the things that affect natural variability. Variation in the sun and volcanoes. Now we do that, and you see there is natural variability in temperature. It's not constant. It varies by 0.1 or 0.2 of a degree, and that's what it should have done last century. Now we know, though, that we added extra greenhouse gases. So let's put those in our model and keep in the natural variability, put all of them in. And now you see since 1950, things should look different. The Earth should be warming quite strongly, because that's when most of the greenhouse gases have gone into the atmosphere. Because this is in the past, we actually do have the temperature record, the observations, that test our model and test our understanding. So we send our Bureau of Meteorology bloke out there with his thermometer, with his satellites, to measure the temperature, and that's what you get. That black line, which you can probably see, follows right in the middle of that wedge that includes greenhouse gases. This is one piece of many, many, many pieces of evidence that tell us that it's these extra greenhouse gases that are leading to the warming, hence to the impacts, and hence to the problem. What I'd like to do now, just before I hand it over to my colleague Leslie Hughes, who's going to tell you more about what this means for Tasmania, there is one principle about the implications of a warming climate for us, for ecosystems, and for infrastructure. And that's the fact that we're not affected too much by an average temperature. The average temperature in Hobart in February is probably around 24, 25. I haven't looked at it, but it's probably mid-20s. And so you say you raise it by 1 or 2 degrees, and what does that matter? The real issue here is if you look at that curve of an average temperature, it's what we call a bell-shaped curve for obvious reasons. But what it means is the average temperature doesn't occur every day. So in February, you get some cool days that are 17 or so, and you get some hot days which are 32 or 33. It's just that most of them cluster around 25. It's these unusually cold or unusually hot days that actually cause the problems. That's what causes the impacts. Now, what happens when you shift the climate just a little bit? And here you see the average going a little bit to the right. That's now the red bell-shaped curve. Look what happens out at the right edge. What you defined earlier, that little wedge underneath the grey curve, now becomes a huge wedge. So what were defined as extreme days become more common. And you have a new wedge that wasn't even there on the old graph. Those are record hot days. And we actually see many more record hot days over the last decade or so, right across Australia, including Tasmania. Why is it important? We design infrastructure for the grey curve, not the red curve. Example, the Melbourne rapid transit system in the city. It fell over when they had record hot temperatures, 45 degrees. The rails buckled. They couldn't be used. Human physiology, we're designed for 37 degrees Celsius. We can sweat a bit for a period of time and get evaporative cooling, and we can survive 39, 40, 41 for a while. But when it gets up to 45, like in Melbourne, you can't survive it day after day if you're in the vulnerable group of people. So this is what really matters for impacts. What I'd like to do now, though, is bring it right back down from these general principles of climate science to what it means for you, the ecosystems you depend on, and so on. I'd like to turn it over to Leslie.
Thanks, Will. Thank you. If climate change wasn't going to have any impacts, we wouldn't really care about it. It would be a few people like Will and a few people down at the ACRC sitting around with their computer models talking to each other, and we wouldn't really worry about it too much. Why we care about climate change, of course, is because of the impacts that climate change has and will have. Now, I realise you really can't see that top graph very well. Some of you might be able to. It shows the temperature increase in Tasmania going back for about 100 years. And Tasmania's been warming up, just like the rest of the world. It's warmed by about 0.8 of a degree, which is actually slightly less than the Australian mainland, so that's a good thing. The bottom map is what's been happening to rainfall right across Australia, and I hope you can see that some parts of that map, which is the rainfall change since 1970, look green, and that's where it's been getting wetter over that period, and the bits on the map that look browner are where it's been getting drier. Now, down in Tasmania, and I realise it's a little bit hard to see, it's almost all brown. There's a little bit of green down in the southwest. The rest is brown, indicating that Tasmania has got quite a bit drier over that period. This is already having impacts on biodiversity. Let me mention just some of the ones that we're more worried about in the future. The picture up there on the right-hand side is actually the broad-toothed mouse. Lives up in the moorlands, peatlands. It's one of the species the subspecies is endemic. Only found in Tasmania. Species like this live up in the high country. Many species are only found up in the Tasmanian high country. They don't occur anywhere else in the world. They're not well adapted to fire, and as these places dry out, we get more bushfires, and they're not very well adapted. There's also a lot of species that rely on snow cover in the alpine and the subalpine zones in Tasmania and on the mainland, and we're losing snow quite rapidly and, as I said, drying out, and those areas are becoming more subject to fire. That bottom picture there is of Lauderdale, not very far from here, the aftermath of extreme storm event last year, great deal of coastal erosion. Sea levels are rising in Tasmania at about spot on the global average, about 3.2 millimetres per year. When combined with flooding in the local region and with storm surges in an extreme event, these are the sorts of impacts that can happen to sandy beaches. About 75% of the Tasmanian population lives very close to the coast. So clearly infrastructure, people's houses, roads and other buildings are also at risk. The picture up there, I hope you can see, it's a Tasmanian lobster. One of the things that's been happening as the waters around Tasmania have been warming up is that the Eastern Australian current, you might remember that from the Finding Nemo movie, that was the current that was bringing all the turtles down the east coast. There's a lot of other things that have been coming down in that current, and there's a particular sea urchin that many of you will have heard of, the long-spined sea urchin. It comes from my home state, New South Wales. It's invaded Tasmania. It really, really likes it here. It's been able to undergo a population explosion. It eats kelp It denudes the kelp habitat, which is where the lobster and other species live, and the lobster fishery is suffering because of it. The fisheries in Tasmania are worth over $500 million a year. And there's more of that to come. This shows Tasmanian waters. The more orange the colour, the greater the temperature projection for the future. The ones on my side are the present day. The ones on the far side are the projections for 2070. The waters around Tasmania are actually warming at least 2 to 3 times the global average. Things are getting very hot. We're looking at least 2 to 3 degrees more warming by the end of this century for the waters, especially off the eastern coast of Tasmania. One of the industries that this will affect will be the aquaculture industry. Salmon, for example, its optimal threshold of the temperature that it likes to live in will be exceeded at 3 degrees, and the current salmon varieties will be extremely stressed by that temperature. Okay, I want to end off with a slide that's essentially about 2 alternative futures for us and for future generations. This is the temperature record. The little black wiggly line is the temperature record that we've already had, going back to 1900 to this time. The red and the blue bands are our 2 futures. The blue band is what we're hoping for. That is, trying to keep temperatures below that 2 degrees, that sort of critical threshold of 2 degrees. And we can do that if we really make an enormous effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If we continue to emit greenhouse gases at the rate that we have been doing, we're looking at that red band. That's called the business as usual scenario. Now, I realise that's just a graph, and for many people it's hard to relate to a graph, so I'd like to make this graph very personal. There's me. I was born in the 1960s, and I'm hoping to live till at least I'm 85 or so, and I've drawn that bar at the average temperature that I will experience over my lifetime. It's not too bad. I've got 2 teenage children. They were born in the mid-1990s, and assuming that they also live till they're around about 85, that's the temperature that they will experience under a business as usual scenario over the course of their lifetime. Now, I don't have grandchildren yet, but assuming my children do procreate at some point, and let's just say they have kids when they're about 30 and those kids live till they're about 85, my grandkids will live through to the next century. And that's the average temperature that they will, and the average temperature, not the extreme temperature, that they could experience over their lifetime unless we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, what we're aiming for is to bring that bar down so that we do have a planet that is habitable by our children and our grandchildren. With that, I'll turn it over back to Tim. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Leslie. I just want to look now about some of the economic consequences of what you've just seen. You can think about the greenhouse gases, at least the excess greenhouse gases we now face, as a form of pollution, and we tend to use a polluter pays principle to deal with pollution. It's a time-honoured principle. We wouldn't have a civilisation if we hadn't done that in the past. Our streets would be ankle deep in sewerage and the air would be unbreathable if it hadn't been for people regulating polluters and also putting a price on pollution. Now, Roger is our economist here, and if I sit here and click through, perhaps, Roger, you'd like to talk through the price issue, if you could.
I might even be able to click through it myself.
Yeah, good. Excellent. I didn't know, yeah.
Now, look, there are lots of things that if we start from scratch, most of the things that we use when we produce goods and services, we pay for. Unfortunately, when we create pollution at the same time, we generally don't pay for it. So as Tim has said, in lots of other areas, sulphur dioxide, nitrous oxide, the community intervenes and says, well, we're going to have regulatory restrictions, or we're going to deal with it through fines or penalties, or sometimes what they call load-based systems, where you're priced for each unit of that you emit, which encourages you to reduce it. Now, if you do that, it means that as people make decisions, they then have to take, for the first time, that particular pollution into account. Well, in many ways, carbon, or greenhouse gases more properly, are the mummy and daddy of pollution, in the sense that they are very diffuse, widespread, and are probably the pollutant that is having the most global impact. So what are a few of the mechanisms that are being used around the world, and why do they work? What we have to do is to find ways of giving business and giving individuals the incentive to believe that this pollution will be dealt with, to price it in, and then to make their investments and consumption decisions based on that. So, how do we do it? Well, price is one thing. We know lots of things in life matter and things that don't matter. For example, 75% of us men in the room absolutely know that size doesn't matter. But on the other hand, 100% of us in the room do know that prices matter. Prices affect what we do. And it's exactly the same all the way through the business system. So if you impose a price on this pollution, it will have an effect if it's at the right level. Now, typically, that price, and this is true of Australian systems that have been considered, that price is imposed on a few at the top of the production chain, because that's very efficient. If you can get to a few small producers, and I think it's something like 500 or so, but we're not explaining or arguing any particular scheme here. But so you impose a price on the pollution that then has an impact on the people who produce more of that pollution. It makes their costs higher. That means that they've got to recover those costs, so the prices of their goods and services go up. And households, if they have a choice, will choose the equivalent product that comes from someone who is producing less greenhouse pollution and is therefore able to do the same product cheaper. It's pretty straightforward. This is not, as they say, rocket science. And if you're spending the household budget and you have the choice of doing an activity that you know is now going to cost you a different amount or cost you more because it involves pollution in some way, for example by using fuel or whatever, you then make that the choice to perhaps even do something different. That, in the first run, has a limited effect. But the real effect it has is in the long run. Because in the long run, what it does is drive the decisions that are being made by investors, by bankers, and by businessmen who are actually creating the capital, who are putting the new facilities in place. And if I could give you an example, I can't find anyone in the Australian energy sector who would believe that a dirty or an open-fired, coal-fired power station would now be built. Why not? Because, first of all, the people who are putting the money up would say, make the risks look too high. We have to do something else. So you then find either you're going to gas, or you're going to renewables, or you're pursuing a very sophisticated coal-fired plant with carbon capture and storage in some sort of way. So what it does is it provides a signal which will drive investment, and over time that turns over the entire stock of the industry. And this is happening not just in the power sector, not just where the prices are being paid, but everywhere. So everywhere business starts thinking about how do we reduce and remove this cost in the new investments that we make. And it also leads to farmers and others who can offset these costs having an incentive to actually do so. So in this way, it works its way comprehensively through the system. By itself, the price is not enough. You also need to support R&D, because there's a lot of evidence that you get failure even with a price in R&D. In some areas, regulation's more efficient than price. For example, in the motor sector, we know that pollution standards on emissions at the tailpipe actually drive more behaviour, more change than just hiking the price of petrol. You could take a number of those examples. Minimum energy performance standards for fridge engines and so on. So it's going to be a mix of regulation and price and support and in public investment in different sorts of activity.
I just want to talk very briefly about opportunities, because quite often when we think about climate change, we think of all of the costs, we think of the dangers that a changing climate will bring to us, but it also brings opportunities because, as Roger said, there is a need for investment in new technologies. And as we've been going around Tasmania for the last few days, I think we've seen that this state particularly is well placed to benefit from investments in new clean technology. After all, clean energy has been a sort of an underpinning of this state's development for decades now. You know how to do it, you're well ahead of the rest of Australia. If you had the means of exporting clean energy to the mainland through another Basslink or whatever else, it may be that you could develop an export industry here for clean energy that would be a substantial benefit to the state in the longer term. So things like these solar arrays, wind power, changes to agriculture, changes to transport systems, all of these opportunities will start opening up as the world shifts from a polluting base, a fossil fuel-based source of energy, into clean technologies. I think it was last year, 2010 actually, was the first year that more was spent globally on these new technologies than on the old technologies. So you can see the shift is already starting to occur. People often ask us when we give a presentation what they can do as individuals. And there is a lot that individuals can do, even though you may feel relatively powerless compared with, say, the actions of government or industry. Ultimately, it all comes down to us. I think Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a few good people can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. And so being informed, being positive, being a leader by making practical changes at home, talking to other people, showing leadership by talking to people, whether you're a member of a sporting group or a church group or a workplace. Talk to people about these things. We all have energy bills, but it's a good way in to starting to discuss these issues. And do something creative. You'd know far better than me in your individual life what you can do, but those actions really do add up to something in the end, and add up to a deeper commitment on the part of society to deal with what is a very difficult problem where the real payoff will be decades down the road when our children are our age, because it's then that if we do nothing, we'll start seeing the very, very severe impacts that we want to avoid. So that's the basis of what we're going to tell you. We're going to switch back now over to you because it's your night, and we'd like to just open the floor to questions and hear whatever comments you have to make. Thanks very much.
As Tim said, it is time for your questions and some answers to come with those. Just to run you through how it will proceed, a number of you have supplied pre-registered questions when registering to attend this event, and we're using both a mix of these pre-registered questions and questions from the floor this evening. Now, I do ask that your questions are very much focused and as brief as possible, and that's in order that we can get as many questions through tonight. We have about 45 minutes of questions to go. So if you could please keep your questions to 15 to 20 seconds. I have installed a seat ejector button and I will press it if that goes longer than 20 seconds. So it is time to get the ball rolling. Let's have as many hands up as we can and get started in the short time that we have. And there's a hand already. Lady in the back row.
My name's Penelope Ann.
Penelope, not Leanne.
No,
Sorry.
Penelope. I live in Risdon Cove, just over the river, and I'm standing for the Greens in the coming election. I was interested in the whole debate about pricing carbon. When you say that those people who price carbon will put the price up, and therefore those who are using more efficient, less emission products will have an advantage. However, it seems as if we're just going to be buying cheaper products from overseas. Is it feasible, you think, to put a carbon price on imports to make a fairer system?
Yep. In every... I've got to take this in two bites. First of all, in all the existing schemes, including the one that's been proposed, and the one that had previously been agreed between the two major parties, there is a form of border adjustment to the extent that emissions-intensive and trade-exposed sectors receive allowances for the carbon that they produce, or the carbon permits that they're going to require. So, for example, the aluminium sector, for example, receives 94% of its carbon free. It gets a free permit. And that goes through right the way through the system. There is an alternative way of doing it, which is called consumption-based carbon taxation, and on that you use the carbon price very much like the GST. It gets added all the way through the system, so it's then deducted when an exporter exports, but if you import a commodity, you pay the average carbon intensity, the Australian carbon intensity, at the border. That has never found favour internationally, and I think it is unlikely to do so. Most people have adjusted in the way that I described first. They've looked at the carbon-intensive, trade-exposed sectors and actually adjusted those sectors at the point where they have to account for their emissions.
So Roger, on the carbon pricing, there is a question tonight from Jarvis Lynn, who asks, if Europe has been trading on a carbon market for years, why are Australians so in the dark about a carbon price?
Well, I think it's one of those things that once you start doing it, suddenly the fears of disaster will go away. This is not going to be a disaster. It is not going to dramatically change the way that people live, but it will put in place those signals progressively over time. There will be, in the long term, changes in the structure of the Australian economy, but that's happening all the time. And if we don't get these right signals in place now, as we're growing and making the investments for the years ahead, we will be backing ourselves into cul-de-sacs that will be very expensive to get out of later on. So I think it's very important to have this progressive move and for the market to get confidence that we're staying there as a community.
Just get the mic to the lady in the orange.
Thank you. Margaret Stedman. This is a general question. The paper's called The Critical Decade, and I wonder if the panel will speak to why the next 10 years are critical.
Yeah, I'll make a comment from the science perspective. And we start from the so-called 2-degree guardrail, and the science is saying that if you cap the temperature increase overall at 2 degrees or less, we have a reasonable chance of adapting and coping with it. If it goes much beyond that, you get some rather drastic and irreversible risks coming into the picture, like loss of a big polar ice sheet, which would eventually mean meters of sea level rise and so on. So that 2 degrees is important. if you work backwards and say, how much more can we emit around the world to have a good chance of staying below that 2 degrees, you very quickly come to the fact that if we don't start, number one, dipping that curve downwards by 2020, and number two, exactly as Roger said, steering our economy into the right investment pathways. If those two things don't happen, it'll be virtually impossible. So it's taking a long-term framework, but then working back and saying, if we don't get things under control this decade and in the right direction, we'll have very little chance of avoiding much more serious climate change down the track.
Fiona Bryan, Bryan Communication Design and Barking Owl Audio. Look, I've been talking with some friends of mine recently about the carbon tax, and we think it's a really good idea to price or be able to put the environment into the economics of bottom lines. But another suggestion was to somehow improve packaging labelling requirements that beef up the expected longevity or life cycle of particular products. There's a lot of products on the market now that have got built-in obsolescence within months, and this is really leading to a lot of overconsumption, we feel, and quite simply raising consumer expectations about a product's life or life cycle could be easily done by packaging labelling.
Well, in many respects, I think what you're getting at is that the whole climate debate, the whole climate argument, is part of living a bit more sustainably in a more general sense. And there's no doubt about that at all. I guess from my point of view, I think the biggest global challenge is not resource constraints. The biggest global challenge is going to be the impact of global warming and the impact that that in turn may well have on the productivity of the agricultural sector and our capacity to feed 7 billion people. And one of the problems with CO2 is that while it fertilises and increases growth, it can actually reduce the nutritional quality. I'm looking at Leslie because she's the one who really knows this. It can reduce the nutritional quality of grains.
Gentleman in the navy blazer.
Peter By, South Sandy Bay, retired helicopter pilot, no political affiliations. In coming to the critical decade, I need to know whether I should man the barricades or be relaxed about it. And I've had problems finding out the basic science. And what you put up there doesn't explain the basic science. And I've been to Professor Garneau as well on this. Al Gore, Professor Tim in his young days, alarmists, would suggest that the feedback mechanism was exponential and we should really man the barricades right now. The climate modellers put in a linear arithmetic progression. You put X CO2 in, you get X temperature rise. The other people, if I mention their names, people will get upset, but the Plymers and the Carters and the Bjorn Lombergs of the world say that it's subject to a logarithmic or subject to the law of diminishing returns. So the biggest problem we'll get is in the next decade, where it does go up 2 degrees. But if it is subject to the law of diminishing returns, and what I'd like to do is get hold of the papers, and also for, say, methane, which is 10 times, I think, CO2, are they different? That's the basic science, and that's never
So Peter, is
explained.
that your question?
Yes, where is the basic science? Is it linear, arithmetic, logarithmic, or subject to the law of diminishing returns?
Yeah, look, thanks for the question. You've mixed up a couple of concepts there, so let me try to untangle them as briefly as I can. This isn't the feedback mechanism you're talking about. It's the direct effect, radiative effect of additional greenhouse gas on the energy balance at the Earth's surface. That's a bit of a jargony way of saying it, but if we want to get into the science, that's what we have to do. It is definitely logarithmic. That's been known for over 100 years. All the models have it in. To say the models have it as linear is totally incorrect. That's a misrepresentation of what the models do. Second thing you talked about is feedback mechanisms, which is something different. So the warming that originally comes from having a change in the energy balance because you have more greenhouse gases, that triggers further effects in the Earth system. Those are what are called feedback effects. There are two fast ones that are really driving the change now. One is an increase in water vapor. As temperature goes up, more water evaporates from the ocean. You can intuitively understand this. You put heat under your kettle, and more water evaporates. This is not exponential. It has certain physics that are in the models quite clearly. We test this with observations. Now, we have already seen, with 0.8 of a degree warming, an increase in the hydrological cycle. I could show you the graphs and give you the references. That's already been measured. That's understood very well. It about doubles the original effect of CO2. The second important one is called the cloud feedback effect. There's more uncertainty around that. That's where the debate occurs between people who think the temperature rise will be less and the people who think temperature rise will be more. That's why the models have a range of temperature rise going into the future, okay? That's the biggest uncertainty, in addition, of course, to we don't know how much we're actually going to emit. So all of that is very, very much understood. The things that you were quoting from the gentleman you quote are basically incorrect science. They do not come out of the peer-reviewed science. They come out of blog sites. They come out of media reports. So my final comment is, if you want to know where to go for the science, you've got to tool yourself up, get into the primary literature in journals like Journal of Geophysical Research, Science, and Nature. That's what I use. That's what other people use. And that separates out what's real science from all the crap that's flying around the blogosphere at the moment.
Kim, I might just add a comment there, since someone mentioned or thought I might have been alarmist in the past. I don't think my basic line has changed at all, but could I just say that 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, when Al Gore was doing his thing and when I wrote The Weathermakers, what we were looking at was that red line on the graph, that early graph, to say by the end of the century, if we go on as we are, we could get some very adverse outcomes. That's still true, still the case. But we are now in a different sort of political and economic environment where the world is actually taking action. And what we're tending to focus on now are the steps that need to happen over this year, this decade, and so forth to avoid that. So it's not that the scenarios of what we're talking about have changed, it's just the focus of where the community's mind is and what we're explaining has shifted.
Tim.
Hi, Jeff Ellis. I live at Old Beach up the Derwent in Tasmania. I'm wondering if the Commission is going to make any recommendations about mandatory energy conservation measures in, say, new houses. I believe in Spain all new houses have to have solar cells on their roofs. For example, when you build a new house, it's very highly regulated. You can't say I'm not having sewage because it costs too much, or you have electricity or plumbing. This is all got to be very high standards. Yet when it comes to something like saving the planet, we say, oh well, that's voluntary. So can the Commission see any value in recommending mandatory measures to save energy?
I might just. I don't think we have a real expert in that area on the panel tonight, but some states clearly already do have that sort of system. I think New South Wales has got a system whereby you have to reach a minimum number of points for your house, which you can get in a number of ways, either through insulation or solar panels or whatever, but you've got to have a certain energy rating if you want before you go ahead and build. So that sort of regulatory approach, it is valuable, sure, and it's probably going to run in parallel with the other sort of market-based mechanisms that we've been talking about. And voluntary action for that matter as well, which they'll all be part of the mix.
Can I just say that, sorry, I'd just say that it's not really the role of the Commission to regulate or to advise government even, is it? It's really to discuss with you about the science and to talk about different options, but not really to get into the regulation of those things.
So we don't make recommendations, but globally we can tell you many countries are doing this, and in Australia many states are already acting in that manner.
Hi, Andy Cunningham, West Hobart. I'd like to know what's the long-term future of the coal industry following the collapse of the Zero Gen project?
Okay, I'll take that. coal globally is so important that I think we will be using coal for 30 to 50 years. I think that's a fact. I assist the Chinese government by sitting on the Premier's Advisory Council, and while they're attempting to diversify out of coal into gas, into nuclear, into renewables at an enormous rate, they know if they are going to put everyone in China onto the sorts of energy standards they need, they're going to be using coal, and that's true through the developing world. So at least for thermal coal, there's a big demand for Australian coal, I can see, over many decades ahead, but diminishing perhaps. And for coking metallurgical coal, that's a required part of the steel making process, and there's going to be a lot of structural steel. So we have a very healthy industry, and you will note that in spite of the discussions and debates that have been going on, and indeed legislation that's been passed in relation to pricing carbon, huge coal investments are continuing, and there have been some major sales in coal companies at very advantageous prices. Now, you might think this is regrettable, but I think it is actually going to be unavoidable. The key thing is to use it as economically as possible, as environmentally sensibly as possible, and as rapidly as possible transit either to less polluting fuels or to using coal with less pollution. Perhaps we might crack the carbon capture and sequestration nut and achieve that at a relatively affordable rate.
I've got a slightly different perspective on that I might give. We don't agree on everything with inside the Commission. I think, Roger, I think you're absolutely right in general, but the 30 to 50 year timeline is a I think it may play out differently. If you look at the relative costs of some of the renewable energy alternatives, which are coming down year by year, and the cost of coal going up year by year, it may be that at some stage next decade or the one after, that some of the renewables will be highly competitive. And I think with technological development, it's very difficult to say really how things will play out over that long time.
I would not disagree with Tim, but there's still a big stock of power stations that will be fed even then, and metallurgical coal is a different matter.
Yeah, it is, but there's some very interesting stuff going on in that space too. But anyway, we can have a discussion later.
And could I ask you there, Roger, that with the global financial state as it is, some of these diversions into renewable energy are going to take longer? Are we saying the critical decade is another decade away, given the climate at the moment?
Well, in fact, if to the extent that the first the GFC and then the Eurozone crisis have had an impact, they have actually helped move us a little bit towards achieving the objectives we should be aiming for in the critical decade. In addition to that, after countries met in Copenhagen, all the major countries, all the major emitters made promises to reduce their emissions. These are not legally binding. I can talk about legally binding later on and what it's worth. But we know that the countries are actually acting to implement those pledges. So I think this is actually, from my point of view, a critical decade, because it is by acting to meet those pledges in a unilateral way, knowing that other countries are acting, that we build the confidence right around the world where you will eventually get to a global agreement.
Okay, we'll just head over near the door and then down to the back in the blue.
G'day. Great to see such a crowd, and there were a lot of people, I believe, who couldn't get in the room today. I'm Rachel Rodham. I live out at Molesworth in the Dormant Valley, where a lot of my neighbours buy water every 3 weeks, even in this weather. Glad I don't live in their house during drought. Now, I think that peak oil will limit our use of fossil fuels, and I'm wondering, some of you would have some insight into peak oil. Will it come soon enough to help us stay below that 2 degree rise?
Quick answer there. You mentioned oil and fossil fuels. There are many more fossil fuels than oil. There's natural gas, there's coal, there's unconventional oil. The projections are, even if we burnt all the oil of the known reserves, and maybe even a bit more, we'd still blow the climate simply by continuing to burn coal. So peak oil is an important issue for the transport industry. It will not, on its own, solve the climate problem.
Just to be clear about that, Will, so we can burn all the oil and gas in the world and still stay below 2 degrees, but we can't burn all the coal. Is that
Absolutely.
yeah, great.
And all the oil and some of the gas, I think.
Some of the gas, okay.
Sorry, in the blue. We'll come to you in a moment, sir.
Hello, my name's Gemma Tillack. I live in Mount Nelson, but I'm also part of Climate Action Hobart, one of our local grassroots groups. My question, I guess, is about leadership. I'm aware that in Copenhagen, our country's failed to reach an agreement. In Durban in December, again, they failed to reach a legally binding ambitious agreement. I'm aware that the Australian government still only has a target of 5% on 2020 levels. And here in Tasmania, we don't have ambitious interim targets. Our government is still failing to set the signal around the level of action that the state here is going to take. So I guess my question is around, what do you think it will take for our political leaders to show leadership? I think you're seeing that the community is showing leadership, but we're being let down by our political masterminds and essentially the Labor and Liberal parties. So take off your official roles, and I'd really love a truthful answer about what you think it will take to get leadership from our leaders.
Maybe I can just tackle that one to start. I'll keep my official hat on because I'm pretty sure I can answer the question with the hat on. I was at Copenhagen. I was chair of the Copenhagen Climate Council for 3 years in the lead up to that meeting. And like everyone else, I guess I had pretty high expectations. But halfway through the year, Ivo de Boer, who was heading up the UNFCCC, said, we're not going to get a global legally binding treaty out of this. We should be looking for something else. And as Roger said, that something else turned out to be the Copenhagen Accord. And under that accord, what countries did, instead of everyone saying, oh, you have to have a target of 92% and you have to have a target of 92% and you can have 96 and whatever, countries set their own actions and their own agendas. And so they'd pledge and say, well, what we'll do is put in, lots of wind energy, for example, or we will have an energy intensity target or whatever else. That has been a very, very useful mechanism to move forward because countries that can do things their own way very effectively have been able to pledge action under that thing. Now, you're quite right that Australia pledged just a 5% reduction under the Copenhagen Accord. That might seem disappointing to people, and it seems like a small figure, but the Australian economy and population are growing so strongly that if we'd taken no action on climate change, our emissions would have grown by around about 25% between 2000 and 2020. So if you add that 25% of growth that would have occurred to the 5% target, you get a 30% reduction overall. So that's what we're talking about, 30% over business as usual reduction. Now, I'd love a more ambitious target, but that's a target that's been agreed by both sides of politics in Australia. And we have mucked about for years now without getting a mechanism in place that will help us achieve that target. So we have exactly 7 years, I think it's 10 months and 9 days to achieve it. Massive reduction. So when you think about it that way, it's a big thing for us to achieve that. It really is. In the case of the US, they've got a 17% reduction target below 2005 levels by 2020. They're on track to achieve that. Canada, and you hear a lot of negative things about Canada, blocking and obstructing progress and so forth. They're also on track to achieve their minus 17% target, the same as the US. So there's something like 90 countries now have pledged something under that Copenhagen Accord. If you add up all of the pledges, they get us about half of the emissions reductions that are required to avoid dangerous climate change. So sure, they're nowhere near enough, but we are making progress at Durban very slowly again, towards a global agreement. I can't stress to you enough how difficult it is to get 193 national representatives to agree on anything. And it didn't help at Copenhagen the fact that, you know, a lot of people from developing countries like a fag, you know, every now and again. There was nowhere to smoke. They had to walk about a mile in the freezing snow to have a fag, and it didn't help tempers. It was terrible. And when you've got, you know, the president of Sudan heading up the G77 and Amnesty International saying he should be thrown in jail for breaches of human rights things, it just wasn't a good environment. So all of these real-life difficulties do occur, but we are making progress. In terms of Tasmania and your local targets, could I just say I think that's one area where there is really room for doing something more ambitious. I worked in South Australia for a number of years where the South Australian government saw enormous opportunities for renewable energy development in that state as a major export industry from South Australia and job creator. They set their own 33% target by 2020, which they're on track to achieve, which is fantastic. So they've been able to do it. I can't see why other states can't up their ambitions and develop coherent statewide energy policies, especially where you've got the blessings that you have here for your clean energy, to say we're going to transform this into a major export industry. So I think that those are the sort of things that, yes, give us ambition. Every level needs to up their ambition, but we don't underestimate the difficulties of doing some of this.
Let's head down here to the gentleman in the black shirt. And then I know there's a couple of hands that have been up for the whole time out back. I can only see a hand and not a face, so if you could just bring the mic to you, great. We'll go here first.
My name is Lyle Smith and I'm from New Zealand. As a matter of how you run the meeting, I understood you to say that you're going to take registered questions and then questions from the floor. Are you still intending to do that?
Yes, we're taking some registered questions, but I think because there's such a lovely flow and lots of hands up, we'll do our best to get through the hands up as we can.
Okay,
you got a question for the Commission,
I submitted a registered question. Do you want me to
Yeah, do you have it with you, or I can read it out
I
for
have
you?
it.
Or go for it, sir.
Go for it.
Analysts of the Vostok ice cores report that CO2 has historically increased after the warming has occurred, commonly an interval of 800 years. The question, is it likely that the existing increase in CO2 is related to the medieval warm period? And this is a concept by Dr. Gerrit van der Lingen, who's a prominent paleontologist in marine work in New Zealand.
Yeah,
Sorry.
The answer is it's highly unlikely that there's any relationship there for a couple of reasons. One is the medieval warm period was not a global phenomenon. It was mainly a northern hemisphere phenomenon. Second of all, we do understand the Vostok and the Dome Sea ice cores really, really well. You're right that CO2 lags temperature, but it's a complex system, so that word feedback that we talked about earlier comes in again. So what happens is, as the Earth's orbit changes subtly, you get an increase in solar radiation, particularly over the Southern Ocean, as it comes out of an ice age. That triggers an outgassing of CO2 after the temperature rise, as you say, because CO2 is less soluble in warm water than cold. Once that CO2 comes out, we know its physical properties, it drives further warming, which drives further outgassing. So it's what we call a reinforcing feedback loop. The second big reinforcing feedback loop is, as this warming occurs, the big ice sheets, particularly those that are now over Scandinavia, halfway down North America, start to retreat. And as they retreat, the Earth's surface absorbs more sunlight and it warms further. So you have two big long-term reinforcing feedback loops that are triggered by the initial warming. But the real important fact is, if you only look at that initial warming by the sun, it can only account for about 15% of the total warming between an ice age and a warm period. The other 85% comes from the CO2 and comes from the retreat of glaciers. So the answer is CO2 does both. It arises from an initial warming and it drives further warming. We're concerned now that we're driving the CO2 up first before we don't have any warming. The Earth was not warming until we put this additional CO2 in the air. We're worried that if we go over 2 degrees, these big feedback mechanisms I just described will kick in, and that's when we have real problems.
Well, the Vostok ice cores don't indicate what you're talking about.
Yes, they do.
I have one more item about your numbers about 32 centimeters of sea level rise in 100 years.
Yes.
There's a group of sea level experts in Sweden. They're headed by a fellow by the name of Dr. Morn, and he's predicting that we have 17 centimeters, not 32. This is a vast difference. How do you reconcile that?
Well, the 32 centimeters is actually the observed rate today. It's 3.2 millimeters per year. If you multiply that by 100, you get 32 centimetres. So the longer term rate since the late 1800s has been around 2 centimetres per year. That rate has risen over the last 2 decades to 3.2. Now we can actually unpack that. Part of that is coming from the fact that, as I showed you, the ocean is warming. And as materials warm, they expand. Part of it is coming from the fact that continental glaciers, like the ones on the Himalaya and the Andes, are melting. And they put additional water into the ocean. But over the last 2 decades, an increasing amount has come from the big polar ice sheets, the ones on Greenland and the ones in Antarctica to the south here. You add up those three and you get 3.2. Now, under any conceivable scenario, the ocean is not going to cool. It's going to continue warming. We'll get more thermal expansion. As the temperature continues to go up, we'll get more loss of ice, not less. So the 3.2, the 32 centimetres, is an underestimate. Now, getting back to the Swedes, I actually happen to work a lot in Sweden, and I know the scientific community there. That opinion that you quoted is an outlier. I suspect what the gentleman there has done is taken the fact that Sweden is still rebounding from the last ice age. So they're getting land rise as well as sea level rise, which makes the apparent sea level rise look less. So again, you have to understand the fundamental science before you can make those extrapolations.
Thanks, Professor Stefan.
Yep. Hi, my name's Bill. I'm from Melbourne originally, but living in North Hobart. My question's about renewable energy, and there's a debate at the moment in Canberra about whether the byproduct from forestry or biofuels should be counted as a renewable energy. I'm wondering if there's any validity to that claim.
Okay, it looks like we have to do a bit more science underneath this. Okay, the issue here is how do forests play a role in renewable energy or carbon storage and so on. So to get to your question, my rule of thumb is if you take what's sometimes called forest residue or forest waste that arises from forestry operations that are going to occur anyway, that waste, if left alone, oxidizes and goes back up to the atmosphere anyway. So you get it back up into the cycle. If instead of letting it oxidize on its own, you oxidize it in a generator, produce electricity, and then do not substitute that for fossil fuels and leave those fossil fuels in the ground, you actually do get a gain. So then when the forest regrows, and assuming this is a forest where you already have forestry operations, this is the critical assumption, then you do have a renewable source. But the point I make is the accounting, like in many cases, is rather tricky, and you have to do a full life cycle accounting, or as we say in the business, a full carbon accounting. But there are conditions under which, yes, it can be renewable, but you've got to be careful in how you do that.
Just mindful of the time, we only have about 2 minutes left, so a young lady here in the navy top will then head to the front, and we've had your hand up for a while.
Hi, I'm Cherie from New South Wales. My question is about, I guess, education and where is the, I hear a lot about a price on carbon or the regulation coming from government, and these all seem to be top-down approaches. And I think that people aren't on the ground, we're not getting the message, well, like on a broad scale, that this is a critical decade. And I'm just asking, where is that education coming? Why aren't people knowing that this is a critical decade and we need to change things fast? I'm really frustrated hearing about the price and the time that it's going to take to stop using coal power and for this price to trickle down and stop the action. Sorry.
If I could just...
Well, look, I guess you've put your finger right on our job. That's what we're supposed to do. I wish we were more effective. I wish we had a hall full of 1,000 people that we could do. But we've put our reports out. We've pointed out that this is the critical decade. It's been accepted by both sides of politics, as I said. You know, and I share your frustration. I would love to see things moving faster. But could I just say that sometimes, you know, when I look back and think, where were we 7 years ago? Well, 2005, Al Gore hadn't written An Inconvenient Truth. Public awareness of the issue globally was very low. The scientists were pulling their hair out with anxiety because they could see this problem building, but no one was doing anything. With all respect, Roger, a lot of the meetings about negotiating on reducing carbon emissions weren't going all that well. And since then, we've come a long way. We've had the Copenhagen Accord, we've had the Durban Agreement to go further. We've had 90 nations pledge action. Sure, it's all insufficient, but I think we can think, and that was only 7 years that we've achieved that. 7 years from now, if we continue powering on as we are, I hesitate to think what sort of world we'll be in. Will wind energy be cheaper than coal? Will solar now then be taking off like anything? Will electric cars be really penetrating the market? Electric cars run by renewable energy. These things are possible. I hear your frustration, but unfortunately with issues like this, often it's just hard work, and commitment, and putting backbone in our politicians and others to get the right results.
Can I just add something? Could I just add something to that? I share your frustration as well. I think we all do. But it's not enough to just feel frustrated and think, well, somebody else ought to be doing something. It's actually up to every individual to do something, really. Let me give you an example of a person who's sitting down here in the front row, Amanda McKenzie, I won't make her stand up. It's all right, Amanda. We did that in Launceston. Let me give you an example of Amanda, though. She got really interested in this issue after reading Tim's book 5 years ago, and she and a friend started the AYCC, the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. It's got over 60,000 members now, and that was what 1 or 2 people actually did to raise awareness. So don't feel frustrated, do something is the message.
And on that, we'll take the question to the young gentleman and ask if you are a member of the AYCC.
Hi, I'm Dan Haley. I'm actually the state coordinator of AYCC Tasmania. My question's to you, Roger. With your economic knowledge, I was wondering, obviously dealing with the effects of climate change afterwards would be greatly costly, and dealing with an energy crisis would be just as hard. But realistically, how hard or what would it take to make a switch to 100% renewables, say enacting Beyond Zero Emissions 10-year action plan?
It won't happen in 10 years. It's simply too disruptive. The price is too high, and even Tim and I would agree on that. I play the conservative, sort of old, boring bad cop in this, and Tim has the exciting new ideas. It will take time. There is inertia in the system, and there's a huge stock of capital investment that is already there. It already exists. This is the world we've got to deal with. It changes relatively slowly, but taking that coal story, well, I think we'll be using coal. I don't think Australia will ever build another coal-fired power plant domestically for energy, because as I said, I don't think anyone would finance it unless it is one with full carbon capture and sequestration. I know it is terribly frustrating, but economic and social systems have inertia, just as the climate system does, and that's what we're trying to do, and what we hope you will do is actually get that rolling. Now, having said all of that, I think Tim's right. The technological frontier is open. There are very exciting things that can happen if the incentives are there, and if governments feel empowered by their own people, whom they're also supposed to be leading, of course, to actually do what's needed for that to happen.
Yes, my name's Graham Finesse. I live locally, and people look at assets. People look at a new car, they look at a new TV, but our assets here in Tasmania are our old growth forests. That's an asset to Tasmania. That's what all of our tourists come to see. Now, they asked us, go and show us these high conservation old growth forests. You point them out, you tell us which are the very, very important parts that we need to save. And we've pointed them out to the government. And you know what? That, right in the middle of each one of those areas, are where they're logging. Now, asset, that's our asset. That takes in the carbon dioxide. Everyone knows that they give us the oxygen. We give them the carbon dioxide. It's a balance. It's a circle. We look after each other. We chop down them, we're killing ourselves. We're killing our planet.
Could you direct a question to the Commission, please?
Why are they chopping down their old growth forests?
Short and sweet, the way we like it.
Well, that's a great question, and one that I could only... Actually, I will answer it. I will answer it, because I was in Kalgoorlie recently and talking to a group of school kids out there about mining. And one of the kids, 8-year-old girl, said, "Why is it that we're killing all of these animals and destroying all these plants when we make a mine?" And there was someone from one of the mining companies there. And I said something like, well, you know, it's probably because as a society we value the minerals and the wealth they bring more than we do the animals and plants on that particular spot. It's self-evident, right? There's a value, we place a value on things. And the miner said, "Oh, that's not really right, that's not fair." And I said, well, let's think about it a bit. If we found out that Ayers Rock was full of gold ore, you know, what would you do with it? And he thought for a moment, he said, "I'd come up from underneath." and it is a values question, you know, it's what it's really about. And unfortunately, we're in a position where, you know, those values are perhaps not skewed towards, or increasingly they're skewed towards conserving those forests, but there has been traditionally a different value set. And I think it's the way we think about value that's important. Well, that's a value, that's right, but greed for money means that we value that more than we do the other.
My name's Mark Duffett, I'm from Lindisfarne. Is it sufficient for wind and solar to be cheaper than coal? And I'm thinking of Germany, which has now got something like 60 gigawatts of solar generating capacity. Just picking a day that I looked at recently, 13th of February, that produced a peak of 1.8 gigawatts. So for most of the time, it was producing less than that. Can we afford to bet the climate on those technologies? Or should we follow the example of the one country that has decarbonised its power to the extent required and used the technology that it used? That country is France. The technology is nuclear.
I think, look, Roger may want to give an economic perspective on this, okay. And then I'll do some social.
I think all of us would agree that we don't see any great silver bullet that's going to solve the climate problem. We see brass buckshot, lots of things that can be done. One of those things is the nuclear option. That involves a really serious, careful look at the full life cycle, carbon and other cost implications. And there is no doubt that if you do that, it is quite expensive. So, for example, the community has to pick up the insurance effectively for nuclear power plants, because you can't insure or reinsure on the private market because of the scale of the risk if something goes wrong. Now, having said that, I think you need to work through, in the circumstances of the country and the attitudes of the individuals, the people concerned, what risks they're prepared to take, what they're not prepared to take, and nuclear power is generally assessed as not being economically attractive at much below the equivalent of a carbon price of $60+ per tonne. There are quite a few renewables that are more attractive than that. However, that might still be line ball with something like carbon capture and sequestration. Certainly gas, closed cycle gas is going to be probably cheaper. So it really is looking at the circumstances, and Tim's reminded us, technology is changing very rapidly in each of these spheres, and keeping abreast of that. And you can't make a promise forever in the future. But we might just close on the thought here that as far as renewables are concerned, Tasmania has an enormous resource, and that's in a way the opportunity to be the renewable battery that provides instant power to the southeast Australian grid. I think that opportunity, combining wind and hydro power, is quite a potentially powerful one.
If I just say, in terms of what Roger was mentioning here, your capacity, your battery capacity, if you want, is twice as large as the Snowy Mountain scheme. It is enormous. So the value of that as an asset is just huge were it able to be linked into the southeastern grid. So when you look at wind energy, it's not just what's being generated at any one moment, it's the potential to harness with other technologies to create a greater benefit. So I'll leave it at that just as a thought for you.
We've just got one final question. The lady in the back, the orange, if you direct that.
Inga Visbu from New Norfolk. I'm interested in the greenhouse...
Sorry, if you could just stand up for us. Thank you.
Inga Visbu from New Norfolk. I'm interested in the greenhouse gas impact of meat production and whether the Commission thinks it would have a real effect if the world ate less meat or dare I say maybe none at all.
Sure, yeah. Look, there's varying figures on this, and I've had a bit of a, I'm probably the best person to try to look at this, but had a bit of a look at it. It depends very much on the production processes that are being made and how you measure the greenhouse gases. But we have to remember that it's not just meat production that produces greenhouse gases. There's, rice production produces large volumes of methane. And agricultural practices obviously do as well, ploughing and so forth. They all have their impacts. So my personal view, and it may not be shared with the rest of the commissioners, is that what we should do as we source our food is go to technologies and producers that are seeking to minimise their environmental impact, minimise their water use, minimise everything else relative to their peers so that we get a better outcome.
On that, it is dinner time, so Tim, I will invite you to the lectern just to conclude with the comments and also just to remind us about what we can do as individuals each day.
Good. Thank you. Look, at the beginning of the night, I neglected, very remiss of me, to note the presence of Andrew Wilkie, who was here through almost all of our meeting and has now left. So if you see Andrew, could you say that I did thank him? And, it was great to see politicians, to see our political leaders here at meetings like this. I think it really does need to be recognised. But thank you all too for being part of a great evening for us. I think we had a really tremendous diversity of questions and inputs. It certainly started us thinking. I hope it's energised people in the audience here as well. In our last 2 days in Tasmania, what I've seen is not only that there will be consequences to Tasmania if we don't deal with climate change, but enormous opportunity here, particularly in the clean energy sector. I know that the state has tight finances. I know there are a million problems staring at people, but it seems to me that that opportunity to grow an export industry here for renewable energy could be a tremendously valuable thing. As you go about your everyday life, you'll meet doubtless other challenges, and it would be tremendous if we thought we could go away from here this evening a little bit empowered and ready to take opportunities and create opportunities so that our children will inherit a better world, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day. We need to start doing things to make sure that they enjoy the quality of life that we currently enjoy today. Thank you very much for being here.